Hey there, welcome back. I'm Dr. Barbara Woods, and this is the Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Show. And I don't know if you can see, not right now, but Bjorn is in the room. So he usually goes upstairs and does not come in the room that I live stream from. But today seems to be a different day for him. So we could have some major distractions. So today we're going to talk about the importance of safety in complex trauma therapy. And safety is important in every kind of therapy, but particularly with complex trauma because of the injuries and the emotions and the lack of trust that has been in relationships in the past that creates this complex trauma. So we want to understand and address safety for those clients, and it may be a little bit different than addressing it for somebody who's coming in for anxiety or depression because of the history of relational injuries. So what we want to do is we want to give therapists specialized knowledge and effective strategies for building this safety in the therapy relationship and to help them experience safety outside the therapy relationship as well. So what we'll talk about today is just a brief understanding of complex trauma to kind of how it fits in with safety. We want to look at strategies to enhance safety in therapy, building and maintaining trust with clients who have experienced that betrayal or relational trauma, and the roles of boundaries in creating safety, cultural sensitivity and responsiveness. That's a huge, important part of safety for a number of clients. And client inclusion and goal setting when we're starting out in therapy and where therapy needs to go. And then facilitating some experiences with secure attachment in complex trauma. So let's get started with a brief review of understanding complex trauma. So complex trauma is usually related to developmental trauma in childhood. Developmental trauma in childhood is trauma that occurs during a developmental period and can disrupt development in several domains. I've also seen characteristics of complex trauma in people who haven't had developmental trauma, but they have repeated traumas over long periods of time. So like police, paramedics, those kinds of employees are subjected to trauma on a regular basis, and they can develop some of the same symptoms, but we're going to talk specifically about complex trauma in the context of developmental trauma and intergenerational trauma. So there was a proposed diagnostic criteria by mainly Bessel van der Kolk. Spinozola is another author that is in a lot of the literature about developmental trauma and complex trauma. And that's where I pulled this from. If you want the reference, let me know, and I will be happy to give it to you. So the proposed diagnostic criteria were exposure to two types of developmental trauma. So they needed to experience relational trauma, hurts within a relationship, and they had to have attachment disruptions when they were in childhood. So those are the two criteria for the developmental trauma history. And then they look at two categories of where the impacts occur. And these are emotional and somatic dysregulation or attentional and behavioral dysregulation. From the developmental impacts, they've kind of narrowed it down to what you most commonly see for adults with complex trauma. So emotional and somatic dysregulation includes emotional dysregulation. So you'll either have reactivity where there's a lot of fight or flight in a relationship, or you'll have kind of a disconnected numbness where there's more of the dorsal vagal response or kind of numbing out in relationships and numbing out to their own emotions. So what can happen is they'll have an inability to recognize feelings, both in their body and in their feelings or emotions. So the somatic dysregulation can be either a disconnection where it's almost like their head isn't attached to their body. There's no sense, they don't have any sensation or activation in the body. They can't feel things. If you ask them, like, where do you feel that in your body? They won't be able to tell you, because they've had, in order to survive, they've had to dampen that down and not allow awareness of it to occur. Or if there's not that disconnection and numbness of the somatic dysregulation and somatic experiences, you'll have a phobia of it. So a lot of people with complex trauma, they have an actual phobia of emotions, and it can be highly triggering and feel very threatening to try to figure out where they feel that in their body or what kind of emotions they're experiencing. So those two, the emotion dysregulation and somatic dysregulation, are really important to maintain awareness of when you're trying to establish safety in the therapy relationship. So these two types of dysregulation can result in an inability to recognize emotions or feelings in the body, and there may be an impaired ability to identify and label what they're feeling. So they may have a vague sense that they're feeling something, but don't really know what it's connected to or what it's about. Under the attentional and behavioral dysregulation, so what you may find is either heightened or dampened sensitivity to threat. So there may be the person may be very quick to identify threat, and they may over-identify threat. So that might be faulty neuroception, where they neurocept threat when there really isn't a threat because their system is so sensitized. Or they may be dampened to threat sensitivity. So they'll be in the middle of some kind of big episode and they won't even recognize, they'll just walk right through it and won't even recognize that it's dangerous. So that's the dampening down of that threat sensitivity, which creates a huge vulnerability because they can't detect true threat in their relationships and in their life. So the reactive is more for self-protection. So that attention and behavior dysregulation, if they're reactive to things in their environment, it may be more for self-protection. One other thing you'll find is problematic coping skills for self-soothing. So in order to dampen down or regulate, they tend to lean towards coping skills that aren't healthy and create more problems. So that's where you'll see pursuing unhealthy relationships, substance abuse, gambling, all those kinds of things, the excitement of crime, stealing cars, all those kinds of things are attempts at self-soothing, but they're really problematic. So the signs and impacts of complex trauma in adults, you'll see the symptoms of PTSD. So you'll see hypervigilance, avoidance, intrusions, changes in thoughts and mood. All of those symptoms will be there, but you'll have some additional symptoms as well. Those additional symptoms are that emotional reactivity or dampening. And these symptoms, they're significant and they're persistent. So it's not just a small period of time in life where they are kind of in a numbed state. These are significant and persistent throughout their life and through long periods of time. There's also relational impacts. So these symptoms impact their relationships with other people, where they may be hard to connect with, they may be very reactive, they may have kind of stormy interpersonal relationships, or they may just be kind of hard to connect with. So that impacts their relationships and their children, their relationship with their children and parenting. The other thing that's really important with complex trauma is the impact on identity and sense of self. And this is related to dissociation. And dissociation is really important when we look at developmental trauma, because that is with disorganized attachment, which is a hallmark of intergenerational trauma. That dissociation is one of the key distinguishing factors. So we have to account for difficulties with dissociation in their lives and also in the therapy setting. So it's pretty common sense of why safety is important in therapy. And Dr. Porges, who is the leader of polyvagal theory, he developed that. He says that safety is the therapy. So if we don't have safety, we're really not able to do therapy. So it's very critical with complex trauma and intergenerational trauma because of that developmental trauma, those relational impacts, and the attachment disruptions. They may have never felt safe in the context of a relationship or in general. So that safety can be very difficult for them to experience and difficult for them to embrace and feel like they can trust that. And that safety in relationships is impacted because of that developmental trauma. It's those relational impacts and the attachment impacts that create this difficulty with safety. And when we look at intergenerational trauma, providing safety for the parent who may have unresolved complex trauma, that creates the foundation for the parent to provide that safety to the child. So we have to work really hard at creating an experience for the parent to have that safety, to be able to experience connection and attachment in a relationship in the therapy setting so that they can use that with their child and know what they're trying to create. They have an experiential sense of what they're trying to provide their child with. This right there is the key to arresting the transmission of intergenerational trauma. So that it's really important that safety, it is the foundation of all therapy, and especially with intergenerational trauma. So a few strategies to enhance safety in therapy. This is a whole big area that there's many books written on this. The main author is Deb Dana. She's got a book of exercises for therapists to use with their clients. In this video, we can't go that in depth. So we're going to cover some of the things that are contribute to that sense of safety, but they're not the exercises to create the safety in the relationship. We might get to that at a later date, but not for today. So it's so important to create the physically and emotionally safe environment for clients. So one thing you could do is audit your therapy setting. So look at noise levels. Are you on a busy street that sometimes will have sirens go down the road, or that will have kind of booming of trucks as they hit bumps? Is it accessible? Is it easy to get into and doesn't feel uncomfortable? It's not in a back alley. It's private, but it's also got some ease of entrance and comfortable seating and all of that. And it's just accessible, and it feels like it's easy to enter and feel settled in there. And accessibility also applies to various disabilities. Do you have a ramp for people to get in? All those kinds of things. You also want the environment, obviously, we're therapists, to be physically warm and inviting. So you might look at your color choice, the type of furniture, all those kinds of things that create an environment and a container for people to experience a sense of safety. Your intake process is another area that you can create safety in. So if it's clear and they know what's going to happen. So sometimes clients come into therapy, and if they don't know that they're going to have like an intake session, they may come in and expect to just be able to talk about everything they need to talk about, where we want to do an intake and kind of narrow down where the problems are and what we want to do, what kind of goals we want to set. So if they're aware of this is how the intake process works, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. We're going to come up with some goals, and then the next session we can talk about whatever you need to talk about. There are some times where clients are highly dysregulated, and in order to create safety in therapy, you need to have the first session where they can just kind of let everything out. They may not have ever had that. So it's really important that their needs are met, but that process is clear. And we want to meet the needs of clients to introduce them to therapy. So we really want to make sure that we know what they're looking for and what they are hoping, especially if they're being referred by an agency or they're kind of mandated to be in therapy for reunification with children. it's really important that we understand what the client needs too, beyond the referral source or beyond how they've come into therapy. So intakes with complex trauma, they may need to be done over a few sessions because it's not every day that you sit down and go through all the traumas that you've experienced or all the impacts or even had awareness of that. So it's really important to go slow. And as Janina Fisher says, going slower is actually going faster. So having sensitivity to how titrated your intake process needs to be, that is part of the reason that the 5 domains checklist is kind of a useful document that you can use throughout therapy rather than a pencil paper test where you answer all these questions and you get kind of a framework to work from. It's more of an ongoing assessment to keep the therapist aware of things that can impact therapy and the impacts of intergenerational trauma, but it's also a way to kind of go slower, but keep those impacts in mind as you're going through therapy with the client. Another way to enhance strategy is just being authentic, predictable, and consistent. So that will help create safety for clients. If we're having a low energy day, if we didn't sleep good, or we've dealt with a crisis earlier in the day, I usually tell people, like, I'm a little bit tired, and if I yawn, it's not because of you. I'm just tired, but I'm going to do my best to keep my energy up and to pay attention and that kind of stuff. And they're usually really responsive to that. We're humans, we're not perfect. And I think sometimes that helps them see that we're not a perfect person that they're coming in to talk to, and kind of creates a sense of safety and authenticity for them as well. So looking at like the authenticity, predictability, and consistency with your policies and procedures as well. So depending on how you have your contact between sessions defined, which you do want to define this, you want to keep that consistent. So if you have auto reminders on that you're not available over the weekends and to contact a crisis stabilization unit or crisis center or hotline, you want to kind of stick with that, but you also want to have a little bit of flexibility as well, because there are times where we have to look at our policies and procedures and meet the need of the client, particularly if they're in a crisis or have some difficulties. So it's all balance about having consistency and structure with flexibility. So some of the areas that are common to look at are boundaries around time. So staying on if you do 1 hour sessions, staying to that hour, or contact between sessions. That's another important one. And really defining, if you're not available, where do they get the support? What kind of hotlines are available? Who their supportive people are that they may be able to reach out for, just so that they have something, a framework or kind of like a safety plan in case there's something that happens, because we're not always going to be available. So it's important to have that defined. And just our responsiveness too. How are we going to, do they expect us to respond within 30 to 60 minutes of receiving an email? Or do we let them know that during the day, I'm pretty busy with appointments and it might be the evening or the next morning that I can get back to you? So just having those things clearly spelled out so that if they're experiencing something where they feel like they need to talk to you, they have that framework where they don't feel as rejected or like you're not there for them if you're not available right on the spot. So transparency and authenticity and our own self-awareness also will enhance therapeutic safety. So I think it's important to have a client, to allow them to have a sense of who we are as a person, because they need to know that we're human and that we are people, and that we're not just there in a role that's kind of cold and there for whatever purposes, maybe our own income or things like that. We just really want them to know that we're human too. We have to do that with boundaries. We can't discuss our problems with clients in that. So it's really important to just be authentic and allow them to have a sense of knowing us. One of the ways that's really easy for me to do this is through Bjorn. So Bjorn is very easy to talk about like where activities he does outside, his training, and then they get a sense of how I care about the dog and how I have to protect the dog and those kinds of things that helps them see my character as an individual. So the caution and the boundaries around that is that it should be things that are quite public. It shouldn't be private things because that's just the boundaries as a therapist. Another important thing about authenticity and self-awareness is to have a lot of humility. And that includes basic humility and also humility with cultural differences or cultural impacts. Excuse me, that we want to make sure that we have the openness to learn from our clients and we can recognize those things and be responsive to them. We're going to shift into building and maintaining trust, specifically with clients who have had betrayal trauma or relational trauma. So betrayal trauma is a trauma that happens in the context of a relationship. So it could be between a caregiver and child or parent-child, could be between partners, could be with a trusted adult, a supervisor, a teacher. So if there's a violation or a breach of trust in that relationship, that could be under the category of betrayal trauma. And what you usually find when people have betrayal trauma, you'll see more anxiety and depression. You'll see kind of hopelessness related to relationships or a lot of preoccupation and fear related to relationships. It'll be hard for them to depend on others. That's that fierce independence that is a skill to help you get through, but eventually it's no longer useful. Or they may seek support from unhelpful people. So they may put themselves in vulnerable positions trying to get help and not recognizing those cues of threat or danger. So they keep trying to get support from people who are not able to give them that support. And then that makes those wounds even harder to manage and cope with for them. We also want to look at their negative self-beliefs because this is what kind of results with betrayal trauma or relational trauma. And this is why we specifically have this in the 5 domains checklist of intergenerational impacts and why we look at the child's negative self-beliefs. It can tell us a lot about what maybe some of the intergenerational beliefs are about, like maybe you can't trust anybody, the world is a horrible place, those messages that have been passed on between generations. But it also helps you understand that sense of betrayal trauma and how it's impacting the child's sense of self. And we can look at those in the parent or caregiver or adult as well. So when we look at rebuilding trust, again, it comes back to consistency in our behavior and responses. So we have to maintain kind of a contained amount of variation in how we present ourselves, how we respond. There are times where if somebody does something really amazing or achieves or accomplishes something at work, that you can kind of go beyond that and get really excited for them. But there is a level of consistency in our behavior and our responses. Another thing is to extend compassion and allow the client to understand that you can empathize or feel what they're feeling and understand where they're coming from. But we want to do this in a balanced way so that we don't trigger shame, because some clients have never had an experience with compassion where somebody has understood, seen, heard them, and it can be very threatening to them. So we have to kind of balance that and make sure that we don't trigger shame when we're offering compassion. A slow and steady approach to building rapport is also really important, not thinking that we're further along in building that rapport than we may be, and really watching that process and being conscious of it is gonna also be really important so that there's not glitches in that process. Another thing that I have found that's really helpful, particularly for intergenerational trauma, is that we can provide a fresh perspective on behavior. So if we look at their behavior, emotional reactions, and we frame those as being they were adaptive at the time that they were used and became strong, they're just no longer adaptive. It pulls a lot of the shame and the self-blame that a lot of clients can feel. It kind of shifts that and it helps you build that trust. And it's accurate. It fits in with polyvagal theory and really helps them understand and bring to life those polyvagal interventions. So we also have to have the next area is well-defined boundaries in creating safety. So we've talked about these a little bit in pieces earlier, but there's clear boundaries are really important for therapy because they provide protection for the client. It tells the client where the lines are, what they can expect from you, kind of what you expect from them as well, but it gives them a lot of clarity about the relationship and it helps them feel more protected. So it creates a sense of safety for the client when there's those boundaries present. And it can also help create that clarity, but also consistency. So very important because these all enhance therapeutic trust, which is really that safety and foundation of therapy. So the main areas we want to set and maintain professional boundaries are confidentiality, um, and its limits. So they need to know that what we talk about is confidential, but there are these criteria that if they're met, I have no choice and I have to break confidentiality. So they have to, that should be standard in your practice, but it may be something that you have to repeat a few times, especially if they're in a heightened emotional state or feel quite defensive or numb when they come in for therapy. You may have to kind of stay on top of that and continue to reinforce that idea of confidentiality and its limits. Boundaries around time of appointments. So sometimes we have had people kind of drop in and want to be seen, and we have to stay consistent with appointment times, unless, of course, it's a crisis. But then we go back and define our policies and procedures and expectations around crises. We also want to have good professional boundaries with the expectations of the client and the therapist. So if the therapy that we're doing requires between session assignments or homework, we want to make that clear that they're going to be expected to bring that back or they're going to be expected to have implemented something. And what their expectations of as us as a therapist. So that's really important because sometimes they think that we can just read their minds and we should know exactly what's happening and have the perfect intervention, but we need that collaborative process with them. And again, the boundaries on contact between sessions with phone calls, emails, all those kinds of things that we want to have real clarity about and have those boundaries. The next area we're going to talk about is cultural sensitivity and responsiveness. This is such an important area with intergenerational trauma because a lot of people impacted by intergenerational trauma, it has occurred in the context of some type of cultural group or cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, spiritual abuse, all those kinds of things. So it's so important to understand and integrate cultural backgrounds into therapy for those reasons. So strategies that we can use for increasing cultural sensitivity and responsive therapeutic practices include that personal and cultural humility. So being very open to feedback if they have not been happy with something or if something you've said kind of hurt their feelings, having that humility to allow them to talk about that and and process that is really important. It's really important around their culture as well. One of the worst things that I've seen people do is to learn parts of a culture and then try to demonstrate that you have awareness of the culture, but it's almost like you're teaching their culture to them. So that's where the cultural humility comes in, where you have to have that awareness and that knowledge, but you also have to be very humble and not get where you're trying to teach them their culture. Continuing education and cultural competence is really important as well, specifically if you're working with a particular group of people, if you're working with refugees, if you're working with things in the world right now with genocide, war, historical traumas. All of those things are really important to get as educated as you can. So it's important to be proactive and not expecting the client to teach you about it, but asking for clarification on their particular experiences or beliefs in the context of what you've learned. So that will give them the ability and the open door to talk about cultural things and to give you feedback and correct you if you have misunderstood something, or if something you've learned applies to one group of people but not their experience. So it's really important to have that educational and cultural competence and not expecting your client to teach you, but also being open for clarification and discussion. So one thing I've found really important is if I hear a client describe a situation and it sounds like there's racist overtones, they may not be spoken right out, but I call that out and I ask them if they're feeling like that. If they're feeling like that, we look at that and we look at how to support them. If they're not feeling like that, I still have my ears pricked up for it. But I follow where they're at in their judgment of the situation. But it's really important for them to be aware that we notice those things and we can talk about them with them. So when we're working with different cultures, we may have to adapt our approaches to fit with their needs. So we can't go beyond our boundaries as a therapist, but our approaches may need to shift in order to support them. So we may need to adopt some boundary changes. And some of the two that I'm most familiar with are from working with indigenous populations, where time is more of an evolving concept. It's not a time of 1 o'clock. It's around 1 o'clock and we'll get there when we get there, which we have to kind of accommodate for, because that's part of the cultural belief, but it can negatively impact therapy if they only come for 30 minutes for a session. Maybe different if you're working in a community and have more flexibility with time rather than in private practice where you're based on a time schedule. The other boundary that I've seen that may need more flexibility, but you have to follow confidentiality, is family involvement. So there was a time where I worked in an indigenous community. I did home visits. So I was in the house of somebody, and all of a sudden, like all the neighbors started to come over, family members came over, and they were all kind of in the house while I was trying to have this session with a client. And to me, as a non-Indigenous person working in an Indigenous community, it kind of made me uncomfortable because I'm supposed to protect their confidentiality. I'm supposed to not even let people know that I'm coming there. So we try to make it as private as we can. But I had a really good Indigenous supervisor that I processed this with, and he actually taught me that in the culture, that's actually a good sign that they must have heard positive things and were just coming to kind of check me out, check out the situation. So I guess I did the right thing where I didn't talk about therapeutic things, but I built relationships with those family members, because the family involvement in Indigenous communities is really, really important. So we can't kind of pluck the person out of their family system and then expect therapy to kind of shift that whole family system. And that's why in the intergenerational trauma program, when we get to building family resilience, we have strategies where we include family members and we include extended family as long as the client is okay with that and gives permission. So the other way we may have to adapt is adapting our intervention. So again, in Indigenous communities, instead of using a timeline to get a framework of things or connect patterns and things like that, I'll do it in a circle, or if they're fairly traditional, I'll do it in a medicine wheel where you divide up the times of their life by baby, youth, adult, and elder. If they're not an elder or an adult yet, you may do kind of projected, like, what would you like to have happen in life? And that circular thinking and that circular presentation, it communicates cultural competence, but it also is supportive of their worldview and helps them make those connections better than in a line across the paper. Another way to adapt interventions is in a genogram. So genograms are fairly linear. You've got your great-grandparents, your grandparents, your parents, and the kids, where if you turn that into circular again, and you divide it by age groups of baby, youth, adult, and elder, they make much more connections and recognize patterns when it's in that circle than when it's in that linear format. So that's how we can adapt those things to be culturally appropriate. Again, I had really, really good supervision by an Indigenous person who is also a doctorate in social work. So it's really important to have that culturally competent supervisor as well. Our next area is to talk about client inclusion and goal setting. So a lot of clients who've experienced intergenerational, developmental, complex trauma, a lot of them have had life happen to them. They feel like everything impacts them from the outside in, where we don't want therapy to feel like that to them. We want them to have a sense of control and influence in their own process. So there's some really strong benefits of involving clients in setting their therapy goals. We should always do this, but there's some specific benefits for people with complex trauma. So it provides greater clarity related to the expectations or how therapy evolves, which gives them predictability, consistency, and those are all those things that build trust. It also provides a roadmap for therapy, so they know kind of where they're at. They also know where we're wanting them to go and where they're wanting to get, and how we can line those up and reach their goals. It also creates safety in the relationship because there's fewer surprises. So one of the examples I use to explain this is the intergenerational trauma program is set up in 3 phases where we work to calm the chaos in the family nervous system. So we work on we do parent coaching. We help the parent experience a sense of safety and connection in the therapy relationship so that they can give that to the child. The next step is to address the unresolved trauma of the adult or the caregiver. And then the next step is to address the children's trauma and build that family connection and really strengthen that family resilience. So if we just started therapy and focused on building like their self-regulation skills and attachment with their child to calm that family nervous system down, but never told them that the next step, we're going to deal with your unresolved trauma, that could completely throw them off and could feel very unsafe for them. So that's where that predictability and creating that safety through having that awareness of how therapy would likely unfold and what would be recommended and what they want is really important. A lot of people bring kids in and expect us to only work on the child's difficulties, and the child's kind of the identified or person of most concern in a family system, where it may be all these other things need to happen too, with calming that family nervous system and addressing the parent's unresolved trauma. So it's really important to have clarity so that there's no surprises with that. So goal setting also enhances client autonomy and safety, gives them a sense of ownership, gives them a sense of control. So this is really important for people who have never had influence in relationships with professionals. So when you think about what type of professionals they're probably interacting with, it could be child welfare or child protection agencies where those are happening to them most of the time, and there's a lot of direction given, and they may not have had influence in that relationship at all. It may be with medical professionals that they're told what needs to happen and what they need to do and not given much choice. Or it may be with schools. I've seen situations where there's a lot of trauma in a family. There's somewhat attention symptoms where they're not diagnosed, but there are similarities with ADHD, and the school is just wanting them medicated or they're not coming back to school. So those are examples of how some people who've had complex trauma, when they're working with systems and other professionals, where they may not have had any influence in those relationships. And they may not have had influence in their relationships with their own caregivers and people that they had in their lives. So we want them to have that ownership of therapy and a sense of influence and control. So this is where trauma has happened to them. We want therapy to happen with them. So just a few practical steps. In the intergenerational trauma program, we clearly communicate those overall goals. So we have their input and discussion on the best way to proceed. So the program is developed based on those three phases: calming the family nervous system, addressing the parents' unresolved trauma, and then the child's trauma or teens, and building family connections. So in some situations, the main issue may be that, or the situation may be that the best spot to start is on the adult's unresolved trauma. Maybe the kids are in foster care and they don't have them in their day-to-day lives in order to build these skills with parenting. So you can start with addressing their trauma. Or you may have a child that's really having difficulties and really creating a lot of chaos in the family system, at school, all of that. You may want to start with the child's therapy. So it's very flexible, where you can start where you need to and what's best for each individual family or person you're working with. But there is awareness of the overall goals and what it takes to meet the goals of intergenerational trauma therapy. So we definitely want to get the parents' input and discussion on the best way to proceed in those circumstances. We are at our last section, which is facilitating attachment bonds within the therapeutic relationship. Now, we're not developing a parent relationship with them where we're taking care of them. It's very different, but they may have never had a secure, healthy attachment with another person or with an adult. So it's so important to have them experience that in the therapy relationship. So we may be the first healthy attachment that they've experienced, which is critical for them to be able to extend these skills to their own children and to their other relationships. So that's the purpose of developing that attachment bond in the therapy setting. It's not to create a dependency, or it's not to reparent the person. It's to give them that experience with a secure attachment. So within the context of intergenerational trauma, secure attachment in the therapy relationship, it's what provides the foundation for the parent-child relationship to heal and have better attachment. And it also impacts other relationships as well. So partners, people at work. So that's where our relationship with them and our attachment is the foundation for them to have healthy and attached relationships with other people and know what that experience feels like. It is also the key when you're working with a family system to address and arrest that transmission of intergenerational trauma therapy. So that happens when we create a secure attachment bond with a client and they experience what a secure relationship and healthy relationship is. They're more able to give that to their child, and that right there is what stops that transmission of intergenerational trauma between parent and child. So this is really critical to get this down and to have those skills to do that. So just a few simple strategies, because this is a huge complex area, is to be consistent emotionally and consistently available within those boundaries. So it's not like we're always responsive and always kind of generating, because we might communicate that we don't feel like they can really handle it, or we might communicate that they need to be really dependent on us. So we want to have that balance, but we want to be consistent in our emotional availability. We want to be compassionate and validating without triggering shame. And we want to keep those boundaries. So we want to also have responsive and attuned interactions with them. We want these clients to have a really gentle sense of being seen, heard, and felt at a level that they can tolerate it. So we don't want to be very intrusive with our seeing, hearing, and feeling them, because that can trigger that lack of safety in relationships. We want to have a really gentle sense of seeing, hearing, and feeling what they're feeling, so that they have that experience of attunement and responsiveness from a person in a relationship. So we just have to balance that attunement with how intrusive or threatening it may feel. And if it does trigger that, we need to talk about it, and it needs to become part of the therapy process. And we just really want to create and maintain kind of a holding environment that provides security and promotes security in relationships. So that's one of the most important things that we can give our clients, so that they can have healthier relationships with other people. Wow. So we have covered a lot. We've looked at understanding, kind of a brief review of complex trauma. We've looked at strategies to enhance safety in therapy. We've looked at building and maintaining trust with clients who've been impacted by betrayal trauma. And we've also looked at the role of boundaries in creating safety, and cultural sensitivity and responsiveness, and client inclusion and goal setting, and how important that is for them to feel they have influence and control over their therapy. And we looked at that secure attachment with complex trauma. So our next session is going to be on identifying the impacts of complex trauma with a little more depth. And that will be next Monday. I think 1 week behind with our calendar, so I might try to catch up and do an extra session. If you have not gotten your calendar yet, or gotten into where you can access these videos very easily, go to calendar.barbarawoodsphd.com, and you can get the calendar. You can get all the daily prompts, the monthly themes, the weekly themes, so that it will best support your practice as well. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next week.